Hey there, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Games and Writers Show. I'm your host, Craig Hart, and today we have a really special guest. His name is Kevin Tumlinson. A lot of you probably have heard that name before, and if not, well, shame on you. Where have you been? Kevin is an award-winning, best-selling thriller author. Books available in hundreds of countries worldwide. A long-standing career in film, television, radio, and podcasting. Kevin is a seasoned world traveler and has produced documentary programming and films ranging from historic aviation to military history. His debut thriller novel, The Coelho Medallion, was a 2016 Shelf Notable Indie Award winner. Kevin's popular show, The Wordslinger Podcast, is downloaded each week by thousands of listeners. He is known as the voice of indie publishing, a title he's proud to hold. And he has helped thousands of will-be and new authors build and grow their self-publishing careers. Kevin's love for history, archaeology, and science has been a tremendous source of material for his writing, feeding his fiction, and giving him just the excuse he needs to read the next article, biography, or research paper. He lives in Texas, but works in random coffee shops, cafes, and hotel lobbies around the world. Kevin, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm sorry I put you through that entire bio. I should have given you a shorter...
I edited it down. I don't know if you noticed that.
I actually have a shorter version of that somewhere that should go on the site as on top, like here's the short version and here's the long version kind of thing, but...
No,
haven't gotten around to it yet.
I enjoyed it. I mean, obviously, so far in your life, you've done a lot that's made obvious by the biography, but I was wondering if there is a way possibly to narrow that down a bit. For example, your Twitter bio describes you as a writer of thrillers and thriller of writers, host of the Wordslinger podcast, director of marketing for Drafted Digital. Are those placed in order of importance? In other words, how do you see yourself?
You're going to put me on the spot because if the D2D guys are listening,
well, I just told you before the interview there wouldn't be any gotcha questions.
Yeah.
This sort of qualifies, though, doesn't it?
Yeah. No, that is kind of in order of importance. If it can be said to be that way, I value all those aspects of my life and career fairly equally, but which I know is the non-answer. But the real answer is that if I were forced to choose, it would always be writing and then everything else. The writing career has been, in one way or another, the writing career has always been there for me. Yeah. So, and probably always will be. Right up to the point where they have to tape pencils to my palsied fingers so that I can painstakingly, letter by letter, knock out the next novel.
So have you always wanted to be a writer? Has that always been something that's kind of been in your DNA?
Always. I always wanted to write. It's really bizarre. And I think a lot of writers are like this, though. I think maybe I'm not all that unusual, but I started very young. As soon as I knew how to write, I was mimicking the stories that I loved. I wrote. The joke is that I wrote my first book at 5 years old, which is true as far as it goes. But it was one of those handwritten kind of deals, and I wrote it on a Big Chief notepad, and that was kind of the start. I really enjoyed the idea of telling stories. Ironically, though, despite the fact that I was doing that my whole childhood and dictating stories into tape recorders and pretending all the time, it never really occurred to me that someone could make a living doing that kind of thing until I read Orson Scott Card's Ender's Game in high school in 9th grade. Read it in like 2 hours. I mean, it was just devoured it during a testing period. I had nothing else to do. And he has like a foreword, an author's note and that sort of thing in that book. I think this was like a second or third edition, and it was sort of a note on the new edition kind of thing. And when I read it, I realized, this isn't part of the story. This is the person who wrote the book. This is someone who writes books. And then I realized there was a price on the cover. That means people pay for books. So
Wait a minute here.
no business genius was I really at the early age of like 12 years old or whatever. But I put it all together, and I realized that this is something. This is a career. Again, ironically, did not actually pursue that career directly until many years later. But I did pursue writing. I started writing for the local papers. I started submitting things to magazines. I got paid for writing, so it all counts.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, that's more than I think most of us writers can say. Usually we're, working on a line somewhere and writing at night or some such thing. So it
Oh, don't
actually,
get me wrong. I was doing that too.
you've paid your dues, I
Yes,
guess.
I was I've had a wide variety of careers. If you looked at my LinkedIn profile, it's like the first page of Indeed. It's got every job you can imagine. I worked in retail. I worked in various industries. I was a electronics engineer for a while, so I have an engineering background. And I wrote through all that, by the way. Like I would do when I was doing the engineering stuff. One of my tasks was to design and build test fixtures for circuit boards, and then I'd have to run, a certain number of tests, like 1,000 tests on that board. And those were usually automated and pretty boring. So I would sit. I wasn't technically allowed to do this, but I mean, I would sit with a little notepad and a pen, and I'd write little short stories, and so I practiced the whole time. But
That's funny. That's funny.
writing's always been there for me.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember one of my jobs, I worked at circulation for a library, and I always enjoyed the slow times because I would open up my email and open up an email draft and begin writing in the draft. That's the way I could save it and like access it later. That's another one of those things probably wasn't really supposed to be doing, but when you have an addiction, you feed it however you can. I suppose.
Right. I don't know what would happen to me in the age of the pocket computer, the iPhone or whatever, because I literally have written short stories and I've written chunks of novels on my iPhone using the on-screen keyboard.
Oh, wow.
So I imagine that I would slip off to the restroom for a little bit and emerge.
He's been in there a long time.
He is. Suddenly, I've emerged freshly published. And so,
was your family supportive of this? Growing up, did you share this writing dream with them at all?
I think they figured out pretty quick that this was something I was going to do. My grandmother, in particular, was very supportive of me as a writer. She was supportive of me. I could have said I was going to be, a veterinarian or anything. I mean, I could have told her anything and she would have supported it. But the writing, she knew that was a passion. At one point, so this was during the days when Writer's Digest, before they had like their whole university thing, or whatever they're calling it now, they had the Writer's Digest school. And I had just casually mentioned one day that I spotted something about that in the back of a Writer's Digest, and she enrolled me in it as like a birthday gift. And I went through that. I had a mentor writer, Ardith Mayer was her name. I believe she has since passed. I've had a hard time trying to track her down since those days, but I had the opportunity to correspond with someone who was publishing, and ask questions and share my stuff and get feedback on my writing. And, I still have behind me here is a bookcase filled with all kinds of writing related books. And there's a Writer's Digest school guide in there that has all the articles and everything that I was assigned to read. So I held on to all that stuff. I always hold on to that stuff, man.
Yeah.
Anything writing related.
Oh yeah,
comes in and never goes out.
Yeah, oh man, I own way more books on writing than I'll ever read. I mean, I've read a lot of them, but it's just if I see one, like, oh, okay,
I know it's an addiction.
Yep.
Between writing books, anything to do with writing, and blank notebooks,
Oh
especially
yeah.
the really pretty ones. I own 1,000 Moleskines. Many of them are filled by now, but I have many more that are not. And I got pens of every description. Addicted to pens. And I don't write by hand, by the way.
Yeah,
In fact,
and you
I
need yeah.
actively avoid writing by hand if I can help it. So,
Yeah, but yeah, there's just something about, I don't know, but the romanticism of it all. I mean,
right.
hell, I'm just kind of surprised I haven't been collecting, like, quills and ink and
I know.
whatnot.
I'm tempted for the.
It's the next step.
Do have typewriters. I've got two of them behind
Yes,
me. If you can
awesome.
see behind me, and that royal one on my right is a really cool one. It only types in cursive, which I thought
Really?
was really interesting.
Huh.
Yeah. And if you're asking if I've ever used a typewriter to write any of my work, the answer is yes, I have. And not these typewriters per se. I have lost the skill of writing on a typewriter. I can type very fast. I'm a very fast typist. But when I'm on a typewriter, it's like, ting, 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 and,
Yeah.
you got to put a lot of pressure in that. I got enough carpal tunnel issues.
Seriously. What was your publishing journey like? We touched on it a little bit. Like, I mean, you're known as a voice for indie authors and the indie
Yeah,
publishing world, but did you pursue traditional publishing early
I
on?
did. Yeah, I actually had a traditional contract several years ago, like around 2006. I got an advance. I actually got a pretty big advance for that time and for now. And I was kind of going through the contracts. I'd already signed everything. I was going through everything and kind of putting pen to paper, trying to figure out, what I'd just done. I'd already handed over my manuscript. I was getting edits.
Mm.
um, and I kind of figured out, there were these clauses about marketing in the contract, and some of the requirements were pretty heavy for a guy who, basically this money represented the largest sum of money I'd ever had in one place.
Yeah.
And I was still, even with the advance, I was still pretty broke. And they were telling me I would have to pay my own way for a lot of the marketing stuff I was going to have to do, including some travel. And, there were some requirements around that. It was a really bad contract. And I ended up paying back the advance. I had to actually dip into savings, what little savings I had, because I had bought a motorcycle. I'd bought,
Right.
like I was in my 20s, man. Was I? Maybe I wasn't. I was in my 30s. I was young.
Yeah.
So, and I'm not good at math apparently, but I started paying everything back, and I tried to buy the book back, but they were very gracious about allowing me out of the contract, except I was not allowed to own the book for a set period of time.
Oh.
And so I didn't get to publish that one. And then later I got that book back, and I've looked at it and I'm like, that book was nowhere near ready, and also was not my genre. It's very fortunate. Well, I'm a Christian. I was very blessed
Mm-hmm.
that all fell apart when it did. Because once it did, I started. Well, for a time, I was a little depressed, and kind of decided maybe this wasn't for me after all. But then in 2008, indie publishing really started taking off.
Mm-hmm.
Self-publishing. I should call it self-publishing the way they did then. I like indie publishing because, indie music, indie film.
Right.
I feel like we've got we have a little bit more ownership. Self-publishing still feels taboo to me sometimes when I say it. Definitely felt taboo back then.
Yeah. Yes. There was definitely a stigma attached to the whole self-publishing thing. Back in the day, prior, especially prior to Kindle, when you you had physical books and you were ordering boxes and they'd sit in your garage and stuff. It was sort of
selling out of your trunk of your car. And
right. And we all were like, well, this is how John Grisham started. That would try to keep ourselves hyped up. But
yeah, it was interesting. I still remember when I came across it was prior to it being called Create Space. Whatever the name of the service was that eventually became Create Space. And the idea that I didn't have to pay anything out of pocket. All I'd have to do is provide a manuscript and a cover. And That fit me very well. I have a design background, so I designed my own cover. I learned a lot about that process, and I've improved. My early covers weren't great, but they were better than most.
Yeah.
But yeah, and that set me on a path. I mean, from that point on, I was learning everything I could about layout, about metadata, and about cover design and marketing. I already knew some marketing because I'd been a copywriter for years.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, it was really an intense discovery process for me at that point, and thank God for it too, because it allowed me to own my career in a way I never would have been able to, 20 years ago, 30 years ago.
That's the incredible thing too when you think about the indie publishing world. Like not only how much things have changed, but how quickly they've changed. Where we've managed to largely remove the gatekeeper,
Right.
meaning the large publishers and who decide basically what the world reads.
Yeah.
There's now an alternative. Um, when people talk to me about self-publishing, or when I do talks about it, I always like to mention that with that freedom also comes a great deal of responsibility
Yeah.
in terms for us as indie writers, indie publishers, where I think we still have the responsibility to put out the best product we can. Just because we can publish something doesn't mean we should publish it. That sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
I've looked at your work, and a lot of it's clearly should be out there. But it sounds like you're doing it right, and you started from the beginning, so you've seen the whole evolution
Right.
of it. It's a fascinating thing to watch. So, but you've been involved obviously in the indie publishing space for a long time, different capacities, which means no doubt that you interact with writers, industry professionals
Mm-hmm.
from a wide variety of backgrounds and goals. What is the thing that you dislike most now about this industry, and what is the thing that you love most about it?
The thing that I dislike, and thankfully I don't really see it that often, but I talk to enough authors that I know it's still there. Is the sort of retaliatory stuff that happens. You have a group of authors who decide that they want to own a category, for example, and they gather in these little private groups and form a sort of, a tribe of bandits and go out and do things like, tank your reviews or
Right.
spread rumors or, all these heinous, evil things. I dislike that a great deal, and I call it out when I discover it. But and that's thankfully I really don't see it happening that often. It happens in certain genres more than others, and I really would love to find a way to police that, and really just smack someone with a fish. Just I don't want violence per se visited on these people. Just not true violence, but I would like them to have a really smelly, nasty, regrettable experience. The thing I love best, though, is the exact opposite of that, and it is this embrace of everyone's talent and skill and desire and dreams that this community just pours out on people. The community itself just will open its arms and help.
Yeah.
I've seen it, very recently, actually, and very tragically, author Brandon Barr died from cancer, complications of cancer. And, the community really gathered around him to help his family. He knew he was going to die. There was plenty of warning. There was still some hope, but it just, in the end, he lost that fight. But the community was very supportive of him and his family, and just gathered around, seeing something like that. These are strangers,
Yeah.
We don't know each other. We don't live. Half the people in the groups that I was participating in don't even live in this country, and they were organizing events, trying to push book sales and, um, you know, they were doing fundraising. I mean, the community really is very supportive of everyone who's a member. As long as you're not out being a complete tool,
Right.
you can actually have a great relationship with a bunch of amazing people. And that's really the thing that I've always loved most. And then without it, I think most of us really wouldn't do well. I think that it's this community that's actually made the success stories that come
Right.
out of this industry.
Yeah, the funny thing, and this is sort of related that about writing, in particular indie writing, because that puts the entire burden, generally speaking, of marketing and whatnot on the shoulder of the writer.
Hmm.
And since writing is such a lonely profession, introverts tend to thrive in it, and yet they're expected to go out there and do all this marketing.
Right.
And I've seen, and I think that plays to your point where a lot of the success stories would not have happened without the community, because you have people out there who have your back. And
Right.
that is a great comfort to somebody who is not naturally extroverted. And I don't know that many writers who are, to be honest. I mean, there are some, but mostly it's not something they would rather be doing. They'd be rather be in their basement writing.
Right.
And going back to what I said about the freedom coming with responsibility, I guess part of the reason you have these two extremes where people can be tribal and nasty, but at the same time, there's this amazing outpouring of love and affection and support that also comes with freedom.
Right.
And you can't, human beings what they are, you can't have one without the other. I've seen you can clamp down on one, but that tends to destroy something else. Not that you want to support bad, but I feel like the love and support of a community typically will override some of the bad things if there's an overarching goal which is deemed worthy. Which, and indie publishing is certainly that to me, I'm assuming to you and to the community at large.
Hmm.
So you published your first book. Which book was that? Was that the first one in your series?
My first indie published book was actually sci-fi back
Okay.
in like 2008. I published the first of a trilogy, the Citadel trilogy. And I, like a lot of writers, I spent years writing it instead of today. It's very common for people to write a book in like a month, sometimes faster. I've written at least one book in one day,
I
and
feel like in a way, like we're expected to write that quickly too.
there
That's another
does
thing
seem to be, yeah, there does seem to be an expectation for that, and in a way that is a big benefit to you if you can pull it off.
Yeah.
But I think that we probably overemphasize it, because sometimes it just takes the time that it takes, and it would be much better to spend the time and make the book as good as possible. But we have this rapid release idea, and it does work. I use it myself. Where we kind of fall apart on that is I think people forget that you could write the book and not publish it while you write the next book.
Right. Yeah.
And then maybe write 3 or 4 books before you start publishing. And in that, you could do the rapid release and have very clean manuscripts and do it. I don't do that either. I'm writing rapidly for rapid release. But it's something that works for me. It's something I've done my whole life, and I like it. I enjoy the thrill of it, and I don't feel overwhelmed by it like I used to. But my first series was probably took a good 6 years to produce for 3 books.
Yeah.
It was at that point that I really figured out that if I want to do this, I got to come up with a faster plan, which is why I came up with that whole 30-day author thing, and which changed my life. I mean, once I started looking at it I looked at the whole thing as a business, of course, and that helped a lot. But once I started looking at it in terms of discipline and knowing that this is a part of my life, if I really truly enjoy this, if I'm very passionate about it the way I claim to be, I got to give it more juice than I was giving it. And Once I started doing that, that's when things really started turning around.
It's funny, somehow changing that mindset, it
Yeah.
can be so powerful, because that's essentially what happened to me as well. Like, I suddenly realized it's almost like I woke up one day and was like, I have to treat this like a business.
Right.
I don't know if there was a part of me that was like the whiny artist, like, it's art, yeah.
Well, and
But
I do sort of hate having to say this is treat it like a business.
right,
But I think that the thing people forget is that most people, when they go off to start a business, they're actually pursuing a passion anyway. But
yeah,
we as authors tend to think that the passion is the storytelling, the creative stuff. Um, and that is there is something to be passionate about there. But when someone goes off and starts a business, a small bakery or something, a cafe, or a small bookshop, or any small business, they don't go out there with the intention of I really like cupcakes,
yeah,
and I want to make cupcakes all day. They go out there thinking, I really like making cupcakes, and I make really good cupcakes, and I want people to enjoy them, and I want to make a living from that. And that's where we are.
yeah,
We like telling stories. We like crafting stories. There's another component to publishing, which is beyond the creative. That's why people, I think, have often fallen for the trad pub deal.
mm,
I I don't like to diss on TradPub, not like I used to. I used to trash them. Uh, but I've realized after going to numerous conferences and meeting lots of people who have this same dream I have, there is a sort of sadness when I see someone. I met someone I was at San Francisco Writers Conference this past weekend. I met a guy who writes sci-fi, hasn't written his first book yet. He's just still working on it. He's convinced that he has to go traditional. I was having a whole conversation with him, and the problem was that he has a certain perspective about traditional versus self-publishing,
yeah,
and he's not willing to look beyond that, because in his mind, real authors publish with a publishing house, and if you can't do that, then you shouldn't write at all.
yeah.
Uh,
Plenty of
so
those
I
around.
Right. So, I mean, I don't need tea leaves or tarot cards to tell you that guy's future as an author,
Yeah,
right? So you've never heard of him, and that's the way that's going to stay.
yeah,
He will be very lucky if he lands that traditional kind. First of all, he doesn't have a book yet,
mm-hmm.
so no one's going to sign him for fiction, especially science fiction. It's very
Oh,
difficult to
gee,
crack
yeah,
that deal, you know.
yeah,
So, and I knew this. I learned this myself. But the, all that aside, though, I know why he's doing it. Part of it is he doesn't want to have to deal with the business side of writing. He wants someone else to take care of it, not fully realizing he's still going to do the exact same things we do, but instead of a 60 to 70% royalty, he's going to get a 3 to 5% royalty if he gets published at all. So,
well, that's just
there's
yeah, I mean, that's just it. A lot of people want to talk about traditional publishing like it's the promised land, but
yeah,
it may not necessarily be any better than what you could do by putting in minimum effort with indie publishing. And as you
right.
mentioned, you'd get much much lower royalty.
Well, and there was a lot of talk about. I've seen a lot of people write about this. Usually, people who are being very snarky um, about if you self-publish, you basically just throw your chances of traditional publishing out the window. I'm here to tell you, I've talked to more agents than you have.
Hmm.
Okay, more agents than I'm guarantee you. I don't know who's watching, but I guarantee you, I've talked to more agents and more traditional publishers and more editors than you have. And the overwhelming thought on this now is that self-publishing need not ruin your chances at a publishing career, a traditional publishing career. Um, you would have to be terrible for that to happen, in which case you probably wouldn't have had a traditional career in the first place. It's also not quite true that you can go off and make yourself a pseudo success in self-publishing and they'll come knocking at your door to do traditional contracts.
Hmm.
That does happen, but it's not as frequent as people think. But if you can demonstrate, if you can build your platform and you can show that you can sell books and then you go off and sell it, your chances of someone coming around and saying, hey, we're a publisher and we'd like to bring you in, those go up. But the other side of that is now you control your platform, you have experience, you understand the way things work, and you have more negotiating power. So it's unlikely or not, you get more control over your life at that point. And really, I think most of the indie authors I know who become successful at this wouldn't take a traditional contract at this point. I actually know more traditional authors coming out and going full indie than I know indie authors who are trying to get in.
It's the funny irony of it. You're a known quantity, but now I don't need
right.
you anymore.
It's like when you're in high school and the girl you like wouldn't give you the time of day until you started, drinking milk and working out, and now they're wondering why you're not asking them to prom.
You mentioned your fast pace of writing doesn't get to you like it used to. What changed for you?
It was embracing. It was, as the special forces say, it was embracing the suck. Certain things aren't fun. I am not fit, unfortunately, but I know I have been in my life, and exercise is not fun, but you embrace the suck and you do it, and you end up being trim and fit and healthy. I started treating writing in much the same way. I had a goal. I wanted to have X number of books, but I didn't want it to take 40 years to get there. Yeah. And it was on track for that. If I was only putting out a book every 2 years, then I was going to die well before I would reach my goals of, I wanted like 100 books out, I'm at like 40 now. And most of those were written in like a 2-year period.
Crazy.
And then I slacked off because I started doing stuff for Draft to Digital and other things, but I'm back on track again, and I've put out 4 books in the past 4 months. So I'm back on track again. And it's just, I don't know, the thing that changed for me was sort of embracing the discipline of it. And the joke I tell now is, I skip writing days the way I skip brushing my teeth, which is reluctantly and with great disgust.
So I'm going to have to remember that, actually.
You're probably going to hear it again. If you listen to any interviews I do, I say it every interview now. Because once I said it I said it at random on a podcast one time, and then I thought, how clever. And then
we have to work that in a lot.
That's going to come up a lot.
Do you have a daily word goal?
I do. I've allowed myself to become much more flexible about my daily word goal in the past year. It has always fluctuated. When I was full-time writing and I wasn't working for anyone, it was, my minimum was 5,000 words a day. I can still do that, actually. I do that most days.
That's pretty lofty.
And I have done. There was a time where I was averaging 10,000 words a day. I have written at least one 60,000 word book in a day.
Oh, geez.
So you can push. I always push myself. I have a theory about that though, and I think authors should work for that. You should set goals that are screamingly too high for you, and push yourself to meet them. Because it's just like running the mile. If you can push yourself to run the mile just a minute faster than you did the last time, you essentially reset. You reset your ability. What happens when you have to meet, say, 5,000 words and you've only got an hour, which is not the case for me these days, but I mean, I typically write in 1 to 2 hour increments. But if you got to reach 5,000 words and you only have an hour and you're pushing yourself to do it, you tend to shut off all the things that block you from that. You can shut off that inner editor, which you should never listen to the internet while you're writing.
He's a jerk.
That guy comes along later.
Right.
But you know, all the arguments that you have that you keep in reserve, the hesitation and reluctance that you deal with the whole time, the anxiety that you deal with as a writer trying to knock out that scary number, you tend to blow that off and just put your head down and go for it. And if you don't make it, you probably pushed way past your previous record. That's always my goal, is to nudge my line up, up, up. These days I probably do, I set a minimum of 2,000 to 2,500 words for each day, and I always hit that. But I do that because I want to make sure I'm doing something each day. I'm a lot more forgiving of myself than I was. But if I can do 2,000 words a day, I'm knocking out a book at least every 30 days.
Yeah.
And so that has been very beneficial to me. And because it's routine, it's great. But if I decide, next month I'd really like to release a second book, 2 books that month, or I've got another project, another series I want to start, then I can amp it up. I can push myself, and I have the ability to do that, and it doesn't stress me out anymore because I've kept up that routine, and I periodically do kind of like sprints, like writing sprints, like Chris Fox talks about. It's kind of like that. Like I'll occasionally say, today I'm going to do 10,000 words, and then however I work those in, I work them in. But I keep my schedule is pretty fluid, even with the work I do for Draft Digital. But I keep some set hours for D2D. I decided I wanted to make sure I was giving them, I wanted to make sure they were getting their money's worth.
Right.
And my writing career is the most important part of my career. But I love what I do at Draft Digital. I love helping authors, and I love what that company represents.
Right.
So, I set aside time between like 9 and 4:35, and I frequently end up working into the night on certain things, and on the weekends and holidays. I'm never on vacation. But the thing is that old adage of, love what you do and you'll never work a day in your life. I mean,
yeah,
that's been my life for quite a while now, years now. So,
do you believe in writer's block?
I do not. I know what people mean when they say I have writer's block. But it's just like, it's just like anything else. It's self-imposed. What it typically is for me, if the closest I can think of any time I've ever experienced it, is when I knew I had to knock something out, didn't have any idea what it was, and I was more reluctant to start and put the energy into it than I was blocked. Because once you start writing, even if it's just gibberish, even if you start, the first sentence is complete garbage, and it's garbage, but you move past it to the next logical sentence and the next logical sentence, and then before you know it, you are writing, and you get in the flow. That's just the way our brains work. And I know people have arguments against that. They're wrong. I mean, it's just the way I know this because it's not just me. I have worked with authors for years, and I can tell you that, I worked with the toughest authors of all, which was high school kids in an English class when I was teaching. They would say, I don't know what to write. And I'd say, well, start with that. Right? I don't know what to write, but see where it takes you. Because you can edit that part out.
Right. Yeah.
So you got to get past the fear of trying. You got to get past the reluctance. It's the laws of physics. Objects in motion tend to stay in motion. Objects at rest tend to stay at rest. You're at rest as a writer. You have to apply pressure. You have to apply energy to get that momentum going. Once the momentum's going, it's a lot easier to keep it going.
Yeah. Writing really does beget writing.
Yeah.
And if all else fails, sometimes reading will beget writing as well. I found that to be true.
I do tell people to take breaks. Like, if you're blocked and nothing's happening, you're just stressing over it. Anything in your life, writing or otherwise, that you stress and worry over, is going to be much more difficult. If you can stop, take a nap, take a walk, take a shower, relax your brain and think about something else, and then come back to it. I mean, it's what I love is I live in an era now where I carry around this. I have my iPhone off to my left, which is why I keep gesturing over there. I have an array of equipment all around me for writing. I have a 46-inch television on the wall behind you right now, behind the camera. That is the monitor for one computer, and I got another laptop and I got like 4 iPads and an iPhone. I've got all the tools I could ever use to write. What I love is I can take a walk and take this phone with me and relax, and then an idea comes to me, and I can open up. I write in Scrivener, but even if you write in Word or Google Docs or Open Office, doesn't matter. You can open it up on your phone, and you can write a couple of sentences, and there you've started. And starting is the most important part. Starting is most important, and finishing is second most important.
Yeah, the hell of that middle.
The middle stuff is just going to happen.
Yeah,
you can't have the two ends without the middle. So
exactly.
You just get going.
Turning back to your own writing, more specifically, the main character in your thriller series is Dr. Dan Kotler.
Yes.
Who exactly is Dr. Kotler? For example, let's say that we were at a dinner party and you were introducing him to me. What would you say? This
is Dr. Dan Kotler. He's an anthropologist who also happens to have a quantum physics degree, and he consults with the FBI. He's just about the most fascinating character I've ever created. He is literally the most fascinating character I've ever created. And yes, he is an idealized version of me. I will freely admit that. His interests and my interests align perfectly. He just has a better memory than I do. But yeah, that's that. Dr. Kotler is in essence an Indiana Jones kind of character. A little softer than Jones. Like, he's not the fists first kind of guy. He's a thinker and a talker. But he's also well trained, and he can do things when he needs to. So
when you mentioned it, because I was reading through some the reviews of the book, and somebody did compare it to Indiana Jones. I was going to ask you about that. Is that a comparison you embrace? But I think you already.
I do, and I actually get it all the time, and through no prompting of my own. People compare it to Indiana Jones. I can compare him not quite as much to Dirk Pitt from Clive Cussler's stuff, but I get compared to Clive Cussler a lot. And Da Vinci Code is a natural fit. I mean, that's the Robert Langdon character in Dan Brown's series. It is more or less the inspiration for Dan Kotler. So it's like if Robert Langdon and Indiana Jones had some miracle baby, it would be Dr. Dan Kotler.
Well, I'm hooked already. So how many books are in the series now?
There are 6 published full-length novels, 1 full-length novel on pre-order, a published novella that is available for sale, and an unpublished short story that is only available to to people who sign up for the mailing list.
Okay. Now the book, which I believe is coming out March 22nd, is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
That book picks up where the novella leaves off. Is that right?
Right. Okay. Yes.
All right.
I am so. You have no idea how excited I am to finally have that book out, because I wrote, ironically, The Brass Hall is the novella. Quelo Medallion was the first book in the Dan Kotler series. This is book 1. You don't have to read these in order, by the way. I purposely wrote them so they could stand alone, but they do sequence together pretty well. I wrote Quelo Medallion, and while it was being edited, I wanted to write something that I could use to sort of introduce people to the character. And so I wrote The Brass Hall. So it was written after Quello Medallion, but I actually released it before. Because I also, at that time, I was writing for a sci-fi audience primarily, and I needed to bridge them into this stuff. Because I kind of had I was debating it for a long while, but I kind of knew I was going to shift gears and start writing thrillers at that point. I enjoyed the process so much, and the stories fit so well. But the major complaint about Brass Hall was that people wanted it to be a full-length book. It's a complete story. It has its own rhythm and energy. It's got a beginning, middle, and end. It is a complete story all its own. But people just loved it, and they wanted more. And I'm sorry. A little catch in my throat there. That's what a mute button is good for.
I didn't hear a thing.
Yeah. So I started writing. The God Extinction is the new book. That's the one that comes out in March 22nd. I started writing it, and initially what I did was lift the entirety of the Brass Hall and make it like the first 4 chapters of this book. And then I was going to skip ahead 20 years. And Dan Kotler's now a consultant with the FBI, as any of the loyal readers would know. This story was a prequel, so it took place before any of the events that led up to this moment. I started tinkering that together, and I realized I just robbed the book of any energy. Like, if you get into the Brass Hall story, then it abruptly ends, and then we jump 20 years ahead, and now I got to reintroduce the energy as well as the scenario and the character. So what I found was this awkward sort of putting a prologue like in the middle of the book kind of thing. So I decided not to do that, and I pulled it out and I wrote an entirely standalone book, and just I've decided to just point people one at the other, and I think it's better. We're better for it. I think that Brass Hall was its own story, needs to stay its own story. And I'll put a call to action. I forgot to do it today. I was supposed to do it today. I'll put a call to action in the back of that book to point people at this other book, and everyone should be happy. I always struggled with how I was going to do it, but I'm glad I did it the way I did.
It's when you find what a story wants to be,
right? It
seems that's when things often start pulling together for you.
And I was really struggling to graft these 2 stories together. I mean, my writing style hasn't really changed much, but the tone was a little different between these 2 books. So I was having to mirror that tone to make the book feel consistent. And it just wasn't working for me. I mean, there's just so many things working against me that, ultimately it was just better to pull that and do it. And I think I would have done a disservice to the stories and the characters and to the reader if I had left that grafted on there.
Yeah. Now, when you're writing a series, how do you keep things fresh for both you and your readers? 'Cause I can imagine when you're writing about a recurring character, for example, some of the same things could come up again and again, or situations that are similar. How do you keep that fresh?
It's funny. I have a guy who, one of my street team, one of my beta readers, it's like, so this is another Kotler in a cave running from special forces. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. That's going to happen. I keep the stories fresh with the MacGuffin, the object of desire that they're after, and with the dialogue, and with, I progress the characters over the books. But I think one of the things that helps these books stay very fresh, and I'm leaning on this more these days than I did at the start. I stole a technique from comic book writing, which was this idea of stacking A, B, C, D stories. And so through the A story is the title story for the book. And then I'll introduce a B story, and it'll be, Dr. Elizabeth Ludlum is checking out some mysterious message, that she got. And so that B story will also run through the book. The A story will be resolved by the end of that book, and then the B story will tend to become, if not the A story, then at least a much bigger version of the B story in the second book. There's always a different A story,
I
but
see.
what I've got is so I've bastardized this method a little in that each book has an individual B story or A story that's different from
Mhm.
the B story, but the B, C, and D stories do rotate. So the next book, the B story gets resolved, and the C story becomes the thing, and
Mhm.
so it just kind of keeps going that way. They overlap and they stack. Um, so that's how I keep the ideas fresh. Because Dan Kotler, he's an archaeologist. He's going to be crawling around in caves and running from guys shooting at him,
Yeah.
and that stuff's going to happen because that's the core ideas of the book. That
Right.
these adventure ideas. I honestly I see myself as a pulp fiction writer, and
Mhm.
I love that era of fiction. I think I would have done phenomenally well as a pulp fiction writer. I think I
You'd have
would have
been the
been right.
next Walter B. Gibson.
I would have been. I think so. I think I would have been like a Dashiell Hammett, or
Yeah.
I would. I think I would have fit in with those guys at least. Maybe they could have they could have drank me under the table or something. Maybe I don't know. I'm a Scotch guy. I don't know. We'll see. I couldn't have done the alcoholism, but I could definitely do the workload and the work ethic. But the reason I always identify with that era, I think, is you've got these guys who I've heard stories of, like, someone gets a roll of uncut typewriter paper, a spool of it, rigs a little device behind the typewriter so they can just keep typing, you
Right.
know, and then they'll cut it all up later.
Yeah.
Which is essentially what I do. I do that digitally now,
Right.
but they were writing something. You'd have these stories like they'd type the end, and then they'd rip that page out and they'd roll another page in, and it was a dark and stormy night, and then it would just keeps going. I think I am very much like that. I Once I finish one book, actually, if it were not for the marketing pieces that I know I have to do, I probably would just pick up and start writing the next book that instant. As it is, there's like a day or two where I am putting the book together and doing the marketing, getting it going, getting the pre-order set up, and then I reach a stage where I'm like, okay, that's done. Now it's time to get to this book, and that's usually within 48 hours. So,
Yeah, I found it can be dangerous for me anyway to, I always fool myself into thinking, I'm going to take a little break in between books. But to me, that's so dangerous because I don't
it
know if I'm
is.
just intrinsically lazy or what, because my body's
No,
like,
it's
yes.
momentum.
So,
It's
yeah.
not laziness. It's not laziness, except in that all humans are lazy, right? It's
Yeah.
we want to stop, and when you stop, you lose momentum, and it's that much harder to keep going. Which is why I even on the days when I don't write, I tend to do something related to the work so that I
Hmm.
can at least keep the energy of it going. Um, when things have gotten super busy and I had to put the writing aside for a little bit for whatever reason, holidays are a good example. The Christmas holiday, and I wrote every day during Christmas, but there have been times where something's come up. I'm traveling, conferences, and it's difficult to actually find the time to do the writing because you know you're stuck.
Right.
And now that I have the phone, it's a little easier for me to pick up and at least do something, even if it's 100 words that day. But that's the key. Like, don't just stop. Find a way to at least keep a trickle going, because it's like your pipes. When the weather gets cold, you want to open up your faucets and let some water run so that the pipes don't freeze up. Because if the pipes freeze up, they could burst, or it's at least going to be more difficult to take a shower in the morning or whatever. So keep a trickle going, and you don't have to worry about that.
Awesome advice. And I think that is the perfect place to end our broadcast for today. Kevin, thanks so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. I want to give your book a shout out. What if the gods were real? The God Extinction. That's the question Dr. Dan Kotler, archaeologist and FBI consultant, finds himself struggling to answer after a Druidic tomb is unearthed in the mountains of Egypt. Why did the Druids build a site in Egypt thousands of years ago? And what implications does this site have for human history? Dr. Kotler and Agent Roland Denzel once again find themselves facing threats and dangers, fighting for their lives in the mountains of Egypt, and this time they may face the gods themselves. Releases March 22nd. I want everybody to go out and pre-order it right now. Kevin, thanks so much for joining us.
Anytime, man. I appreciate you having me on.
All right, we'll talk to you later.